Dakota Territory, autumn of 1887. Anders Larsen worked alone, his movements deliberate against the vast, empty canvas of the prairie. He was not raising a cabin, not in any way the other settlers in the valley understood. He was building a triangle. His neighbors, men who had broken the sod and built their lives with square-cut logs and honest 90-degree angles, would stop their wagons on the rutted track to his claim. They would watch him for a time, leaning on their rifle stocks, a mixture of pity and contempt in their eyes. He was setting enormous 40-foot timbers into a deep stone foundation, angling them inward to meet at a sharp, aggressive peak nearly 30 feet in the air. There were no vertical walls. The roof was the structure, a steep, unbroken slope that plunged from the sky directly to the earth. To the practical men of the frontier, it was an absurdity. It was a tent made of wood, a glorified lean-to, a shape that belonged on a church steeple, not a family home. They called it Larsen's Folly. Some, less charitable, called it the witch's hat. They saw a fool, an outsider from the old country who didn't understand the fundamental realities of a Dakota winter. He saw something else entirely. He was building a ship to sail through the deadliest storm on Earth, a sea of snow and ice. What did this quiet Norwegian shipwright understand about physics that every experienced frontiersman had missed? The answer would be written in frost, in firewood, and in the simple, undeniable fact of survival. Before we uncover the secrets of his design, take a moment to subscribe to this channel for more stories of forgotten wisdom and incredible engineering. Your support helps us bring these histories to light. The problem in that valley was not merely the cold. The cold was a known enemy, a beast that could be fought with stout walls and a roaring fire. The settlers were masters of the log cabin, a design perfected over generations. They chinked the gaps with mud and moss, built massive stone fireplaces that consumed cords of oak and ash, and banked the foundations with earth to fight the frost. They knew how to fight the cold. But the cold was not the killer. The true enemy, the one that broke men and buried homes, was the weight. Winter began as a whisper in October, a hardening of the ground. By December, it was a roar. Snow fell not in inches, but in feet. It was a dry, granular snow that the relentless wind packed into drifts as hard as sandstone. A storm could last for days, erasing the sky and the horizon into a single, swirling vortex of white. And all that snow, all that immense, accumulating mass, landed on the roofs of their cabins. The standard cabin had a low-pitched roof. It was easier to build, required shorter timbers, and created a usable attic space for storage or sleeping. This was the conventional wisdom, the time-tested method. But this wisdom was born in the forested hills of the east, in places with heavy, wet snow that might slide off, or in regions where a foot of accumulation was a major event. Here the snow did not slide. The wind drove it into every crevice, and the bitter cold kept it light and granular. It simply piled up. A foot, 2 feet, 5 feet. The weight was astronomical. A 5-foot layer of packed snow on a typical 30 by 20-foot roof could weigh over 20 tons. It was the equivalent of parking 12 heavy farm wagons on your ceiling. The settlers heard the groaning first. The ridgepole, the main structural beam of the house, would begin to complain. The sound would travel through the logs, a deep, resonant creak that spoke of wood fibers tearing apart under a strain they were never meant to bear. Families would lie awake at night, listening to the torment of their own shelter, praying it would hold until morning. Sometimes it did not. A sharp crack, like a rifle shot inside the home, would be the only warning. The ridgepole would splinter, and tons of snow, timber, and sod would collapse inward, crushing everything and everyone below. More common was the slow, agonizing failure. The roof would sag, pushing the walls outward. Gaps would open in the chinking, allowing the wind, fine as powdered glass, to scream through the interior. This brought the second phase of the assault, the war for heat. A cabin fighting a sagging roof was a sieve. The precious warmth generated by the fireplace bled out into the Arctic air. The fire, which should have been a source of comfort, became a ravenous monster. A family would burn through a winter's supply of wood in a month. They burned oak, then birch, then poplar. When the good wood was gone, they burned fence posts. They burned furniture. They burned wagon wheels. Inside these struggling homes, life shrank to a miserable circle a few feet from the hearth. Ink froze in its well on the writing desk. A pail of water, left by the door, would be solid ice by morning. A rime of frost grew on the inside of the walls, sparkling in the firelight. Men grew gaunt from the labor of constantly feeding the fire and clearing the roof. Women watched their children, wrapped in every blanket they owned, their breath crystallizing in the air as they slept. This was the brutal reality the settlers faced. It was a battle of physics, and they were losing. Anders Larsen had seen this before, not on the Dakota Prairie, but on the unforgiving coast of Norway. He was not a farmer or a trapper by trade. He was a shipwright. For 20 years, he had built fishing vessels designed to survive the crushing power of the North Atlantic. He understood pressure not as an abstract concept, but as a relentless physical force that sought out weakness and exploited it without mercy. He knew that a flat surface, when faced with immense pressure, will always fail at its center. A ship's hull was curved, not to be elegant, but to deflect the force of water, to distribute the load across its entire structure. A vertical wall fighting a gale-force wind was like a flat-bottomed boat in a typhoon. It presented maximum resistance and invited destruction. He watched his neighbors build their square cabins, their flat walls and low-pitched roofs, and he saw a design flaw. They were building boxes to contain life, but the prairie demanded a wedge to cleave the storm. They were fighting the weight. Anders intended to shed it. They were fighting the wind. Anders intended to deflect it. He had left the sea, but he had not left behind the hard-won knowledge it had beaten into him. He would build his house like he built his boats, not to resist the storm, but to cooperate with its power. The foundation was the first departure from tradition. Where others laid a simple course of fieldstone, Anders dug deep, well below the frost line. He spent weeks hauling granite boulders from a distant creek bed, fitting them together with the precision of a stonemason. He was not just creating a level base. He was building an anchor, a solid, immovable mass that would lock his structure to the earth. His neighbors saw wasted effort. Anders saw the keel of his landship. Then came the timbers. He selected the tallest, straightest pines he could find, felling them himself and squaring them with a broadaxe. These were the ribs of his vessel. He notched them at the base to fit perfectly onto a massive sill plate bolted to the stone foundation. At the peak, he cut a complex joint, a variation of a shipwright's scarf joint, designed to lock the two opposing timbers together so they became a single, unified arch. Silas Croft came to watch one afternoon in late September. Croft was the valley's most respected builder, a man whose cabins were known for their tight joinery and honest strength. He had built the church, the trading post, and nearly half the homes in the settlement. He was a man whose opinion carried the weight of proven success. He stood, arms crossed, watching Anders and his young son, Finn, wrestle another massive A-frame into place with a block and tackle. After a long silence, Croft spoke, his voice not unkind, but heavy with certainty. "Larsen," he said, "that roof is pitched at near 60 degrees. All your heat will go straight up to that peak and sit there. Your floor will be a sheet of ice." It was a sound, logical argument based on the known behavior of hot air. Anders paused, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. "The air will move," he replied simply, his English still thick with the cadence of his homeland. He offered no further explanation. Croft gestured at the soaring, wall-less sides. "A man needs walls. A wall is strength. This is all roof. The wind will get under those eaves and lift the whole thing off its foundation." This, too, was a plausible concern. The prairie winds were powerful enough to flip wagons. "The wind will find no wall to push," Anders said, looking up at the angled timbers. "It will flow over." He turned back to his work, his message clear. The conversation was over. Croft left, shaking his head. His report at the trading post that evening solidified the community's opinion. If Silas Croft, the master builder, said it was wrong, then it was fundamentally, dangerously wrong. The mockery grew louder. Larsen's Folly became the accepted name. Jokes were made about him needing a ladder to shingle his own walls, or that his children would have to sleep standing up. Anders ignored them. He worked from dawn until dusk, his wife Alara often helping him, her quiet confidence a silent rebuke to the doubters. They sheathed the massive frames in thick pine planks, laid horizontally, each one overlapping the one below, like the clinker-built hull of a Viking longship. This created a shingled effect that was inherently waterproof and strong. Over this, they laid down a layer of tarred felt, a material Anders had ordered at great expense from a supplier back east. It was another shipbuilder's trick, creating an impermeable barrier against moisture. Finally, they covered the entire structure with cedar shakes, thousands of them, nailed in place one by one. The finished cabin was a stark, gray triangle, severe and alien against the gentle roll of the prairie. The interior was just as strange to outside eyes. It was one long, open hall, like the inside of a cathedral. The ceiling soared to the peak 30 feet above, but Anders was not finished. Halfway up, at about 15 feet, he built a second interior ceiling, creating a massive, enclosed attic space. This was not for storage. This was the core of his engine. He explained the system to Alara one evening, sketching it on a piece of scrap lumber with a piece of charcoal. He drew the big stone fireplace he was building at one end of the cabin. He drew the warm air rising from it. But instead of letting it pool uselessly at the high peak, he showed how it would fill the lower living space first. Then, he revealed the secret. At the far end of the cabin, away from the fireplace, he had built a series of vents into the floor of the attic space. Near the fireplace, he had built another set of vents, but these were in the floor of the main living area, leading down into the crawl space created by his deep foundation. "It is a lung," he explained. "The house will breathe." The physics were both simple and brilliant. The fire would heat the main living area. As the warm air rose, it would eventually pass through the vents at the far end of the cabin, filling the huge, insulated attic space. This trapped heat would act like a massive warm blanket pressing down on the living quarters, preventing warmth from radiating out through the roof. But the true genius was the second part of the cycle. As this trapped air in the attic eventually cooled, it would become denser. It would sink. Anders had built a series of ducts within the walls, the roof, really, that would channel this sinking, cooler air down towards the floor. It would then be drawn towards the fireplace, passing through the vents in the floor and into the stone-lined crawl space. The crawl space, warmed by the earth below the frost line and by the massive stone foundation of the fireplace, would gently pre-warm this returning air before it was drawn back up towards the fire to be fully reheated. He had created a continuous, passive convection loop, a thermal engine. The house would not just contain heat, it would circulate it, reusing every possible degree of warmth. The steep roof that Silas Croft feared would waste heat was, in fact, the very feature that made the engine work, creating the necessary height for the convection cycle to operate efficiently. The lack of walls that Croft saw as a weakness was a strength, reducing the total exterior surface area and therefore minimizing heat loss. The entire structure was an elegant, integrated system designed for a single purpose: thermal efficiency. The final piece was the exterior. The 60-degree pitch of the roof was no accident. Anders knew the angle of repose for dry, wind-blown snow was about 35 degrees. By exceeding this angle so dramatically, he ensured that snow could not accumulate. The moment its own weight reached a critical point, it would shear off in a clean sheet, sliding harmlessly to the ground. The house would actively shed the crushing weight that destroyed his neighbors' homes. It would keep itself safe. When the first snows came in November, the valley watched and waited for the Folly to fail, but it did not. It stood sharp and clean against the white landscape, shrugging off the snow while the other cabins slowly began to disappear under growing white mounds. The mockery quieted, replaced by a confused, watchful silence. The real test, everyone knew, was yet to come. It began on January 12th, 1888. It did not come as a storm, but as a change in the air. The sky took on a strange, milky yellow hue, and the temperature, which had been a tolerable 10 degrees, began to plummet. A sudden, unnatural warmth, a chinook, as some called it, had tricked settlers into letting livestock out and venturing to town in light coats. This was the trap. By mid-afternoon, the trap snapped shut. The temperature dropped 50 degrees in 3 hours. A wall of black cloud rolled down from Canada, and with it came the wind. It was not a gale. It was a physical object, a solid force that hit the valley like a hammer blow. The wind carried not snow, but ice, a fine, blinding powder that blasted paint from wood and skin from faces. This was the start of what would later be called the Schoolchildren's blizzard, a storm of such legendary ferocity that it would become a benchmark for all winters to come. For 3 days, the world vanished. Visibility was measured in inches. The wind, estimated at over 70 miles per hour, never ceased its deafening, soul-shaking roar. The temperature dropped to 40 below zero, and with the wind chill, it felt like 80 below. In the valley, life became a desperate, primal struggle. Silas Croft, in his expertly built cabin, felt a dread he had not known in 30 years on the frontier. The wind found every minuscule crack in his chinking. A constant, frigid draft snaked across the floor. Despite having one of the tightest-built homes in the settlement, the interior temperature dropped to 20 degrees, then to 10. His wife and children huddled by the fireplace, wrapped in buffalo robes, their faces pale in the flickering light. The real terror was the noise from above. The wind was piling snow on his roof in a massive angled drift against the north side. The ridgepole, a beam of solid 12-inch oak he had set himself, was groaning like a dying animal. He had built it to withstand weight, but this was different. This was weight combined with a relentless, vibrating pressure from the wind. He was burning through his woodpile at a terrifying rate. The fire roaring up the chimney, yet the cabin grew colder. His expertise, his lifetime of knowledge, was failing him. Other families fared worse. The O'Malleys, new settlers in a hastily built cabin, ran out of wood on the second day. They burned their chairs, their table, then the boards from their loft. John Miller's roof on the east side of the valley collapsed, though miraculously his family survived, huddling in the root cellar. Livestock, caught in the open, froze where they stood, becoming grotesque statues of ice. The valley was being systematically dismantled, its conventional wisdom shattered by the sheer, overwhelming physics of the storm. On the third day, a thought burrowed into Silas Croft's mind, a thought born of fear and a flicker of professional curiosity. Larsen, the fool on the hill. What had become of him and his family in their wooden tent? The storm was the exact scenario Croft had predicted would destroy the flimsy structure. The wind should have lifted it. The cold should have rendered it uninhabitable. A grim sense of responsibility settled on him. He had mocked the man, but he would not let his family freeze to death without checking. It was his duty. He told his wife he was going. She begged him not to. The 100-yard walk to the barn was a life-threatening ordeal. The half-mile to Larsen's claim was suicide. He did not listen. Pulling on every layer of clothing he owned, he wrapped his face in wool, tied a rope around his waist, and secured it to his porch railing, then stepped out into the white chaos. The world outside was not a world at all. It was a fluid, roaring, abrasive substance. The wind tore the breath from his lungs. He could not see his own feet. He navigated by memory and by the feel of the land, stumbling through drifts that were over his head, pulling himself along with raw strength. The journey of 10 minutes became an agonizing ordeal of nearly an hour. Several times he fell, losing all sense of direction, the panic of being lost in the white void threatening to overwhelm him. He thought of his wife, his children, and the foolish Norwegian, and pushed on. He almost missed it. There was no great mound of snow to mark the cabin's location. He stumbled past it once before realizing his error. Doubling back, he found it, or rather the clean, sharp edge of it. The structure was almost completely bare of snow. The wind and the steep pitch of the roof had scoured it clean. A deep drift was piled on the leeward side, but the structure itself stood clear, an impossible dark wedge in the swirling white. It was not struggling against the storm. It looked as if it had been designed by the storm itself. He fumbled his way to the door, his hands numb, his beard a solid mass of ice. He hammered on the thick wood with his frozen fist, expecting no answer, picturing a frozen scene inside. He was preparing himself to force the door, to face the grim tableau he felt responsible for. The door swung open, and Silas Croft was hit by a physical wave. It was not a sound, not a light. It was heat. A dense, humid, living warmth that blasted the ice from his beard and brought stinging life back to the frozen skin of his face. It was the air of a summer kitchen, and it felt like a miracle. He stumbled inside, blinking, disoriented, and the scene before him broke his understanding of the world. Anders Larsen was sitting at his workbench in the corner, sleeves rolled up past his elbows, calmly sharpening a tool. His wife, Alara, was pulling a loaf of bread from a small oven built into the side of the stone fireplace. Steam rose from the golden-brown crust, and the children, Finn and Astrid, were playing on the floor. They were barefoot. On the wooden floorboards, in the middle of the worst blizzard in living memory, the Larsen children were barefoot and comfortable. There was no frost on the walls. There was no frantic, roaring fire. The blaze in the hearth was a small, steady, efficient flame, no bigger than a normal cooking fire. The huge wood box next to it was still more than 3/4 full. Silas looked from the calm domestic scene to the howling white fury visible for a moment when the door had opened. It did not compute. It was as if this cabin occupied a different dimension, a place where the laws of winter did not apply. If you've ever had a moment that completely changed how you saw the world, hit that like button right now. Because for Silas Croft, this was that moment. His entire foundation of knowledge, built over a lifetime of hard work and success, had just been demolished. He stood there, dripping meltwater onto the clean floor, unable to speak. Anders rose and gently closed the door, shutting out the storm's roar. He guided the stunned builder to a chair by the fire. Alara handed him a mug of hot coffee. The warmth seeped into his bones, but his mind was still reeling. "How?" Silas finally managed to ask, his voice hoarse. "How is this possible?" Anders simply pointed upwards. Silas followed his finger. He saw the vents, the high ceiling of the living space, and understood he was looking at only one part of a larger system. He stood up and began to walk the space, not as a neighbor, but as a builder investigating a marvel. He ran his hand along the north-facing wall, the one that had borne the brunt of the storm. It was not just free of frost, it was warm to the touch. He could feel a faint, almost imperceptible circulation of air. He went to the far end of the cabin and held his hand up to the vents leading to the attic. A gentle, steady stream of warm air was rising into them. He then went to the floor vents near the fireplace and felt a slight, cool draw. He placed his ear to the wall and could hear the faint whisper of moving air. He was not in a box. He was inside a machine. "The temperature?" Silas said, looking around. "What is the temperature in here?" Anders walked over to a small mercury thermometer hanging on a post. He brought it over for Silas to see. The silver line was steady at 66 degrees Fahrenheit. 66 degrees? Croft's mind did the math with the practiced ease of a man who lived by the numbers of survival. Outside, it was 40 below zero. That was a temperature differential of 106 degrees. His own cabin, the best-built conventional cabin in the valley, was struggling to maintain a differential of 50 degrees and was burning 5 times the fuel to do it. "And the wood?" Silas asked, his voice now full of awe. "How much wood have you burned since the storm began?" Anders shrugged. "Not so much. We keep a small fire. It is enough." He gestured to the wood box. Silas Croft walked over and looked inside. He counted the logs. He knew the size of a standard cord of wood, knew how long it should last. Based on the size of the fire and the level in the box, he estimated the Larsens were consuming wood at a rate that was impossible. It was less than a quarter of what he was using. It was a rate that suggested a mild autumn day, not a historic, life-extinguishing blizzard. The numbers were undeniable. The warm wall, the barefoot children, the thermometer, the woodpile. Each fact was a hammer blow against the foundation of his certainty. He had called this place Larsen's Folly. He had stood with the others and judged this man a fool. The arrogance of it, the sheer, blind arrogance, washed over him, leaving him cold despite the cabin's warmth. He turned to face the quiet Norwegian. He looked him in the eye, and the words came, hard but necessary. "Anders," he said, and his voice was thick with emotion. "I was wrong. I was completely and utterly wrong." He took a deep breath. "This is not a folly. This is genius. You have built something here I don't understand. When this storm breaks, you have to teach me. You have to teach us all." When the blizzard finally ended on the 4th day, the sun rose on a transformed world. The valley was a landscape of alien shapes, of sweeping drifts that buried fences and barns. The silence was as profound as the storm's roar had been. As families emerged blinking into the blinding white, a census of the damage began. 2 homes had been destroyed. Nearly a third of the valley's livestock was lost. Every single family had a story of a near disaster, of a desperate fight against the cold and the weight. And then, the story of Silas Croft's journey began to circulate. It started at the trading post, where Croft, a man not given to exaggeration, told the tale in stark, simple terms. He told them about the barefoot children. He told them about the 66 degrees. He told them about the woodpile. There was disbelief at first, but Croft's reputation was unassailable. If he said it was so, it was so. The name Larsen's Folly died that day. It was replaced by a new one, spoken with a sense of wonder: the Larsen frame. Silas Croft became Anders Larsen's first and most devoted student. He spent weeks at the triangular cabin, no longer seeing a strange shape, but a complex and beautiful system. Anders, a man of few words, taught by showing. He walked Croft through the convection cycle, explaining the role of the attic heat trap and the subfloor warming chamber. He demonstrated the shipwright's joints that gave the frame its immense strength. He explained the precise 60-degree angle of the roof, not as a whim, but as a calculated answer to the physics of snow. That spring, the first new Larsen frame was built in the valley. It was for the O'Malley family, who had lost their home in the storm. Silas Croft led the construction, with Anders Larsen acting as a quiet advisor. The men of the valley, who had once mocked the design, now came to volunteer their labor, eager to learn the secrets of the warm cabin. They learned to dig a deep foundation, to set the angled timbers, to build the double-layered breathing roof. The next year, 3 more were built. The year after that, 6. The design began to evolve as the settlers adapted it. Some built a partial second story into the vast interior space. Others added dormers to bring in more light. But the core principles, the steep roof, the insulated attic, the convection loop, remained unchanged. The Larsen frame became the new standard for construction in the valley and the surrounding region. Travelers passing through would remark on the strange, triangular houses that dotted the landscape. Anders Larsen never sought fame or fortune from his innovation. He was a shipwright who had needed to build a safe harbor for his family, and he had done so. When people asked for his help, he gave it freely. He would walk to their claim, offer advice on selecting timbers, and help them mark out the complex angles for the peak joint. His payment was seeing another family safe, another home that could withstand the worst the prairie could throw at it. The true impact of his design was not measured in degrees on a thermometer or in cords of wood saved. It was measured in human lives. In the decades that followed, other great storms would sweep across the plains. But the valley of the triangular houses suffered far fewer losses. It was measured in the health of the children, who no longer spent their winters huddled around a fire in a drafty, frost-covered room. It was measured in the peace of mind of families who could sleep through a blizzard without listening for the groan of their ridgepole. It was measured in human dignity. Anders Larsen had not just built a better house. He had given his community a tool for mastering their environment. The story of the Larsen frame is a powerful reminder that conventional wisdom is only wise until it meets a problem it cannot solve. The accepted truth is often just the most common solution, not the best one. It took an outsider, a man with a completely different set of experiences, to see the problem not as a wall to be reinforced, but as a current to be navigated. The shipwright saw the wind and snow not as enemies to be fought, but as forces of nature to be respected and understood. His neighbors saw a roof that was too steep. He saw a surface that would shed a deadly weight. They saw a lack of walls as a weakness. He saw reduced surface area and less exposure to the cold. They saw a high, empty peak as a place for heat to be wasted. He saw the engine for a system that would circulate and preserve that precious warmth. The principles he used are alive today in modern architecture. The A-frame cabin became a popular design for mountain and snow country homes in the 20th century, valued for the very reasons Anders Larsen pioneered: excellent snow-shedding capabilities and structural efficiency. The concepts of passive heating, thermal mass, and convection loops are now cornerstones of energy-efficient building design. What is the coldest winter you have ever faced, and how did you stay warm? Let us know in the comments below. If this story of quiet genius and hard-won vindication resonated with you, hit that like button and subscribe for more tales of forgotten engineering and frontier ingenuity. We have many more histories to share. The story you have just heard is a fictionalized account inspired by historical building techniques and the challenges faced by pioneers. The characters, names, and specific events were created for narrative purposes. The engineering and physics principles discussed are based on real-world concepts of thermal dynamics and structural mechanics, but should not be taken as professional construction advice.